I was erased from my own life with a single phone call, delivered so politely it took me a full minute to realize I had just been replaced. There was no argument, no warning, no raised voice, just a calm decision. Already finalized, spoken with the confidence of someone who believed the matter was settled because it no longer included me. By the time the call ended, my absence had already been justified, approved, and scheduled. All that was left was for me to accept it quietly. My name is Eleanor Whitman. I was 46 years old at the time, and by most outward measures, I occupied a life people assume is immune to dismissal. I lived in a restored colonial outside Hartford, chaired 2 non-profit advisory boards, and maintained a social presence that rarely made noise but always made sense. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't obscure. I was the kind of woman people described as solid, which is often mistaken for replaceable by those who mistake volume for value. The morning had been orderly. I remember that because order is what made the interruption noticeable. I had laid out the black dress the night before, not because I was indecisive, but because the gala had been on our shared calendar for 6 months. The tailor's receipt was still folded on the hall table. My phone buzzed while I was reviewing notes for a foundation call later that afternoon, and when I saw Daniel's name, I assumed it was about seating or arrival time. "Ellie," he said, using the shortened version he favoured when he wanted to sound approachable. "I wanted to catch you before the day ran away from us." I leaned against the kitchen counter, pen still in my hand. "What's going on?" There was a pause, the kind people insert deliberately to soften what follows. "I spoke with the board this morning. They've been doing a lot of image calibration ahead of the event." "Image calibration," I repeated, letting the words settle. "That sounds new." He laughed lightly, as if we were sharing an inside joke. "You know how these things get as the date approaches. The optics matter. And with some of the donors attending in person this year, they want to be very intentional about representation." "Representation of what?" I asked. My voice was even. I had learned long ago that tone often reveals more than content. He exhaled, slow and practiced. "They're aiming for a more polished presence on the floor. Someone who can speak fluidly about the initiatives, handle spontaneous conversations. It's nothing personal." I looked at the dress hanging over the chair, the tag still tucked neatly inside. "And how does that affect tonight?" Another pause. Shorter this time. "They think it would be better if I attended with Marissa instead." Marissa, his colleague. The name landed without drama, which I noted immediately. If he had been nervous, it would have arrived louder. "Better for whom?" I asked. "For the board," he said quickly. "For the organization. She's been more directly involved in the day-to-day fundraising conversations. They feel it aligns better." "Aligns with what?" I asked. I wasn't pushing. I was collecting. "With donor expectations," he said. "It's strategic, Ellie, not a commentary on you." I walked to the window and looked out at the driveway, at the space where his car usually sat at that hour. So I'm uninvited," I said, not accusing, just stating. "I wouldn't use that word," he replied. "It's just a shift in attendance." "A shift," I repeated, "from wife to colleague." He cleared his throat. "This isn't about us. It's about making sure the organization presents the strongest possible front." I let a moment pass. "Who made the final call?" I asked. "The board," he said without hesitation. "They were unanimous." "And you agreed?" I said. Another breath. "I did, because it made sense." I nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Did anyone ask me?" He laughed again, softer this time. "Ellie, you're not on the board. These decisions aren't usually collaborative at that level." "Of course," I said. "And Marissa will be speaking on behalf of the donors?" "Yes," he said. "She's been looped into those relationships." I looked down at my phone, at the calendar entry that still read Whitman Foundation Gala. Black tie. "And she's authorized to do that?" There was a flicker in his voice then, brief but detectable. "She's prepared. We've covered all the bases." All the bases, I repeated. Ellie, he said firmer now. This is already done. I wanted you to hear it from me, not through the grapevine. I appreciate the courtesy, I said, and meant something different than he did. Good, he replied, relief creeping in. I knew you'd understand. We said goodbye with the same efficiency we used for grocery lists and travel logistics. When the line went dead, the kitchen felt quieter than it should have. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not stunned, not angry. I'm just aware that something had shifted without asking permission. Then I walked down the hall to my study and opened the lower drawer of my desk. Inside was a thin folder I hadn't needed in months. It contained nothing dramatic, no secrets, just numbers, signatures, and a structure I had built years earlier for the sake of discretion. I flipped it open and scanned until I found the page I was looking for, the one that outlined the current fiscal allocations for the quarter. When my eyes reached the line item tied to the gala, I stopped moving altogether. The percentage was printed plainly, as if it had always been meant to be seen. The most dangerous moment isn't when you discover the truth. It's when you realize how confidently someone has been speaking in your name. That realization doesn't arrive with panic or rage. It settles quietly, like weight added to a scale you didn't know was already tipping. By the time I understood what Daniel had been doing, the question was no longer whether he had crossed a line. It was how long he'd assumed the line belonged to him. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask for clarification or offer corrections. I did what I have always done when something doesn't align with the story being told. I verified it. I closed my study door, pulled the folder back out, and began reading slowly, line by line, the way I had when the foundation was first formed. Anonymity clauses, disbursement controls, signature authority. Nothing had changed, nothing had been amended. The structure was intact, and it answered only to me. The foundation had been designed years earlier for a reason Daniel never bothered to understand. It wasn't a secret. Or it was insulation. My name didn't appear on donor lists because it didn't need to. The work spoke without it. The agreements were explicit about who could speak on behalf of the funds and under what circumstances. There were no grey areas. There was no shared authority by marriage. The document language was calm, firm, and indifferent to assumption. I opened my email archive next, not because I expected something dramatic, but because patterns leave footprints. I searched the gala's name, then filtered by Daniel's correspondence. What surfaced wasn't explosive. It was worse. Casual phrasing, confident tone, messages implying continuity of support, suggesting future allocations, responding to board questions as though the donor relationship flowed through him naturally. He never said my name. He didn't have to. He spoke as if authorization were implied. One email stopped me long enough to reread it twice. It was sent to the board chair 3 weeks earlier. Daniel had written, "The foundation remains aligned with the event's direction and messaging. No concerns on continued funding." It was clean, polished, entirely unauthorized. I felt no urge to react emotionally. Instead, I copied the message into a separate folder and labeled it simply, Context. By the time the formal uninvitation arrived later that afternoon, I was no longer surprised. It came from the gala's event coordinator, phrased as a scheduling update. Regret was expressed. Appreciation was implied. The language thanked me for my ongoing support and noted that representation logistics had shifted. I read it once, then archived it without reply. Silence in moments like that is not absence. It's restraint. That evening, Daniel moved through the house with an ease that told me he believed the issue resolved. He talked about traffic, about the caterer, about how busy the week had been. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't need to. In his mind, the decision had already been absorbed. I watched him carefully, noting the way he avoided specifics, the way he used collective language. They decided the board feels, the organization prefers. as if diffusion of responsibility might eventually become truth. The next morning, I called my attorney. Not the one we shared for estate matters. Mine. We met in her office downtown, a space designed for clarity rather than comfort. I brought the folder. She listened without interrupting as I laid out the timeline, the language, the assumptions Daniel had made. When I finished, she reviewed the documents methodically, her expression unchanged. When she finally looked up, there was no surprise in her eyes, only confirmation. "He has no authority," she said plainly. "I know," I replied. "The board doesn't either," she added. "They've been operating on trust." I nodded. "Trust that was never theirs." She leaned back slightly. "If you do nothing, the funding continues as scheduled. If you act, it can be paused immediately." "Paused," I repeated. "Not withdrawn." "Correct," she said. "Authorization can be revised without explanation." I considered that. The power wasn't in the money itself. It was in the timing. "If I revise it now," I asked, "what happens?" "The event adjusts," she said, quietly. "And if I revise it later?" She held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "And then the adjustment won't be quiet." I left her office without making a decision. That mattered. I wanted the choice to remain intact, untouched by urgency. Over the next few days, I observed, Daniel became more animated as the gala approached. He rehearsed remarks in the mirror. He mentioned Marissa more frequently, always professionally, always positively. The board sent thank you notes addressed generically, confident in their assumptions. No one asked me a single question. The night before the event, Daniel laid his tuxedo out with care. He told me the seating was ideal, that the donor turnout exceeded expectations, that the foundation's support had been instrumental in securing last-minute commitments. I listened without comment, noting how easily he spoke on behalf of something he did not control. When he went to bed, I stayed up and reread the authorization clause one final time. The next morning, my attorney called. Her tone was neutral, deliberate. "I need to know how you want to proceed," she said, "because once the event begins, the impact changes." I looked out the window at a day unfolding exactly as planned. "What's the last point of intervention?" I asked. "Mid-event," she replied. "Once disbursement begins." I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them. "And if I wait until then?" There was a pause on the line, measured and intentional. "Then," she said, "everyone learns who is actually speaking for you." She let that settle before asking the only question that mattered. "Do you want this corrected before the gala?" she said. "Or during it?" I didn't need to be in the room to control what happened inside it. By the time the first guests arrived under the lights, everything that mattered was already positioned, waiting for the smallest signal to shift from certainty to doubt. Power doesn't announce itself at the door. It settles quietly into infrastructure, into assumptions, into the confidence of people who believe the evening belongs to them. That night, I let them believe it too. I stayed home. That was deliberate. Presence would have diluted the clarity of what was coming. Instead, I dressed simply, poured a glass of water, and opened my laptop at the dining room table where Daniel and I usually argued about nothing at all. My phone sat face up beside me, volume on, notifications enabled. This wasn't avoidance. It was a vantage. Distance sharpens perception when you already know where to look. The gala began precisely on schedule. Photos started appearing within minutes, guests stepping onto the carpet, familiar names smiling beside unfamiliar ones. Daniel appeared in the third image, tuxedo sharp, posture practiced. Marissa stood at his side, hand lightly resting on his arm, positioned just close enough to suggest unity without intimacy. They looked prepared, confident, authorized. I noted the board members flanking them, each wearing the expression of people certain the night would validate their choices. I opened the live program stream the organization had shared with donors unable to attend. The opening remarks were smooth. The mission statement landed cleanly. Applause came on cue. When Daniel took the microphone, I muted the sound but watched his cadence. I knew it well. He spoke with the ease of someone repeating a story he believed belonged to him. Behind him, the donor acknowledgement slide rotated slowly, foundation names appearing and disappearing in elegant font. Mine did not appear. It never did. At the same time, my attorney waited. She was in her office, not at the venue, documents prepared, authorization language finalized but not yet submitted. We had agreed on silence unless I initiated contact. That silence carried weight. Every minute that passed deepened the board's dependence on funds already assumed. Disbursement schedules were active, vendor payments queued, auction software primed. Momentum, once established, becomes fragile in ways people underestimate. As the dinner service began, my phone buzzed with a message from a donor acquaintance seated near the front. "Strong turnout tonight," it read. "Well done to Daniel." I did not respond. Compliments have a way of aging quickly when built on borrowed authority. I watched the room through screens, noting the rhythm of the event, the points of no return passing quietly one after another. This wasn't about embarrassment, it was about exposure. When the live auction segment was announced, I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the neighborhood was still. Inside the venue, energy sharpened. Auction items were previewed, bidding paddles raised. The software interface flickered briefly on the stream, a momentary delay most viewers wouldn't notice. That was my cue. I returned to the table and unlocked my phone. I typed a single word to my attorney: proceed. There was no immediate reaction on the screen. That was expected. Authorization revisions don't announce themselves. They ripple. Somewhere in the back end. A permission changed state. A disbursement stalled. A system flagged inconsistency. Inside the room, the auctioneer smiled and continued, unaware that the financial floor beneath him had just shifted. The first bid landed. Applause followed. The second bid did not register. The auctioneer laughed lightly, assuming a technical hiccup. He repeated the item description, raised his voice slightly, and invited enthusiasm. The delay stretched longer this time. On the live stream, the camera cut briefly to the crowd, then back to the stage. A board member leaned toward another, brows knitting. Something was wrong, but not yet nameable. Daniel stepped closer to the stage, murmuring to someone off camera. His posture tightened. Marissa's smile faltered, just enough to be visible if you knew what to watch for. The auctioneer attempted to move on, but the system lagged again. Bids appeared, then disappeared. A low murmur spread through the room, confusion replacing certainty in uneven waves. My phone buzzed once more. This time it was my attorney. Authorization logged. Funding frozen pending clarification. I read it twice, then set the phone down. Inside the venue, the auctioneer paused entirely now. Microphone lowered. The lights remained bright. The room waited, suspended between expectation and realization. On the live stream, the host returned to the podium, offering a smile that was no longer convincing. "We're experiencing a brief delay," she said. "Thank you for your patience." Behind her, Daniel stood very still. For the first time that evening, he wasn't speaking. He was listening. The auctioneer cleared his throat and tried again. The screen behind him flickered, then went blank. The bids didn't come back. They couldn't. The system had nothing left to stand on. The applause didn't return either. It never does once momentum breaks. I closed the laptop gently. Whatever happened next would not require my attention. The room was learning something important, and learning takes time. Inside the venue, the auctioneer stood frozen, microphone in hand, waiting for confirmation that would not arrive. A room doesn't realize it's standing on thin ice until the cracks start speaking back. At first, people assume inconvenience, then miscommunication. Only later do they recognize exposure. That night, the gala hall moved through those stages in order, each one stripping away another layer of confidence. What began as a pause became a question, and what became a question soon demanded a name. I wasn't there to see it, but I didn't need to be. I knew the sequence because institutions behave predictably when certainty disappears. Backstage, organisers would have clustered around laptops and phones, voices lowered but urgent. Someone would have said authorization issue, someone else would have said temporary, and someone eventually would have asked the only question that mattered. Who actually controls the funding? Daniel would have been pulled aside first. Not publicly. Not yet. Respect dissolves slowly. A board member I recognized from previous years would have approached him with the kind of smile that signals concern without accusation. Daniel would have responded confidently at first, gesturing vaguely, reassuring them that it was a mistake. He would have said my foundation's name with ease, as though familiarity alone could substitute for authority. When reassurance didn't restore the system, the tone would have shifted. Questions would have sharpened. Documentation requested. Emails forwarded. The problem with speaking confidently on behalf of something you don't control is that confidence collapses the moment proof is required. Daniel had none to offer. He never had. Marissa would have stepped back instinctively. I imagined it clearly. One small step, then another. Not abandonment exactly, just separation. She was perceptive enough to recognize when association turned dangerous. Her earlier proximity had been calculated. So was her distance now. In rooms like that, survival often looks like neutrality. The board chair would have excused himself briefly, returning moments later with a tight expression and a phone held low. Calls would have been placed, names exchanged. Somewhere in that chain, my attorney's voice would have appeared, calm and unhurried, explaining that donor authorization had been revised. Not withdrawn. Revised. Pending clarification. Language matters when consequences are unfolding. Inside the hall, guests would have sensed the shift before understanding it. Conversations stall when energy drains from a room. Laughter thins. Glasses go untouched. The host would have returned to the microphone again, offering another carefully worded update, this one less confident than the last. The phrase technical issue only works until it doesn't. By then, curiosity had already taken hold. Daniel would have been asked directly, quietly at first, whether he could confirm authorization. Not belief, not intention. Authorization. He would have answered the way people do when they've relied on assumption for too long, by restating what they thought everyone already knew. That the foundation was supportive, that the relationship was solid, that this had never been a problem before. But assumption isn't confirmation, and reputation, once questioned, doesn't wait politely for explanation. Word would have moved through the room faster than any official statement. Donors talk to donors. Board members text other board members. Someone would have mentioned my name, tentatively at first, then with growing certainty. The absence that had gone unnoticed earlier now demanded explanation. By the time the doors reopened and guests were encouraged to mingle again, the event had already fractured. Not collapsed. Fractured. The kind of damage that doesn't announce itself but spreads quietly, undermining confidence in every direction. Daniel's name, once spoken with ease, now carried hesitation. Each introduction required context. Each conversation adjusted its footing. I received a message from my attorney shortly before midnight. They're asking for a meeting, it read. Tonight or first thing in the morning. I didn't respond immediately. Urgency belongs to those who miscalculated. I took my time, letting the silence reinforce what the evening had already taught them. Another message arrived. This one from a donor I had known for years. Is everything all right? It asked. There was no accusation in the words, only recognition. I replied simply, yes, I'm addressing it. That was enough. In donor circles, restraint is often interpreted as strength. Daniel didn't come home that night until late. When he did, he moved through the house carefully, as if unsure which version of it he was returning to. He didn't speak to me. I didn't speak to him. There was nothing left to clarify. The truth had already entered the room without either of us. The next morning, I agreed to the meeting. Not at the foundation office, not at the gala venue. Neutral ground. My attorney handled the logistics. By then, the story had already begun to settle into its permanent shape. Not as a scandal, as a correction. By the time the board members left that meeting, they understood exactly what had happened and why it could not be undone quietly. Daniel had not only misrepresented authority, he had exposed the organization to reputational risk by assuming proximity equaled permission. That distinction matters in rooms built on trust. When I returned home afterward, I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than usual. The house felt unchanged, but I knew better. Some events don't end when the lights come up. They end when the meaning of a name shifts permanently. By the time the doors had reopened at the gala, Daniel's name meant something different in every room he entered. If you're still here, you already know this story isn't about a gala. It's about what happens when people mistake access for authority. Subscribe if you understand quiet power, like if you believe patience beats impulse, and comment if you've ever watched someone overplay a hand they never owned.